Good day, I'm Richard Palestro representing Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library and Rocky Mountain Stamp Show as the moderator for the presentation you will see on the dispersal of Seebeck Postal Stationery of the early 1900s. Our presenter is Michael Schreiber. In 2018, Michael edited and published the revised and enlarged second edition of the book Seebeck, Hero or Villain by Daniele A. Musis. 2 ebook files are available. Both provide comprehensive discussions of Nicholas Seebeck. Michael retired in 2008 as editor of Lynn Stamp News, where he worked for 2 decades. He's been the editor of Nicaro, the Nicaragua Study Group, quarterly since late 2009. He is also the group's secretary-treasurer. Please welcome Michael Schreiber.
This is Charles J. Phillips. Many of you probably never heard of him, but he was a very big deal back in the 1890s, 1910s. In 1940, he wrote an article titled, "How the Market Absorbs Millions of Stamps." It was published in the Collectors Club Philatelist in October 1940, a very short time after he died. The article covers many countries. A lot of it is about the remainders of the German state stamps and reprints of German state stamps. And of course, it deals briefly with the Seebecks. In the article, Phillips stated that in 1899, there were 90 million Seebeck remainder stamps. 90 million stamps. Now, where did he get this number? And who is this guy? Phillips was the proprietor of Stanley Gibbons, the company Stanley Gibbons, from 1890 to 1922. He purchased the company from the founder, E. Stanley Gibbons, in 1890. So over the decades he owned the company, he was an important publisher of albums and a monthly magazine or whatever other frequencies he published. So he knew a lot of people because of his ownership of Stanley Gibbons. He was also president in 1895-97, right about there, of the SSSS, the Society for the Suppression of Speculative Stamps, which sprung up in the 1890s in response to many countries issuing too many stamps, not necessarily protesting Seebeck. In England, the SSSS was after anybody. In the United States, the offshoot of the SSSS, headed up by none other than John Walter Scott, was specifically after Nicholas Seebeck. In the article, Phillips wrote this, it quotes, "Henry Colman told Charles J. Phillips, that then in 1899, he had the enormous number of 90 million Seebecks. By 1917, the stock was down to 55 million, and this lot Henry Colman sold to Bela Sekula, the Hungarian-born dealer who was then operating in Lucerne, Switzerland." A note at the bottom there says the amount was down to maybe 7 million, at least Victor Kneitschel, a dealer in Argentina during World War II, had for sale 7 million Seebecks as one lump. Notice that Phillips was born in 1863. Many of the people that I will discuss that you'll meet, maybe for the first time, maybe you know a lot about them already, were born in the 1850s or 1860s. They represent the second generation of stamp dealers in the United States, basically, and the world. So the first generation was born in the 1830s and 1840s. And then these people who were born the next 2 decades came along and were operating side by side with most of the older dealers who were still alive. How big is 90 million stamps? If you use as a unit a standard office carton of paper, 10 reams of 500 sheets each in a box, you get a number about like this, according to my arithmetic. 10 by 10, a sheet of stamps. Most of the Seebecks were 10 by 10. 100 stamps, 100 sheets is 10,000 stamps in a pad. If you have 10 pads on a side and 10 more pads on a side, in that box you have 200,000 stamps, very roughly, without any interleaving. And they probably had interleaving. So if you take 90 million divided by 200,000 stamps in a box, you get very roughly 450 cartons. 5 cartons by 5 by 18 equals a small semi-trailer load. Think of those short, stubby trailers that you see trucks pulling on the freeways. Not the longer trailers, but the shorter trailers. Basically 5 feet by 5 feet by 27 feet long. It's a big load. Perhaps you could get it into a UPS delivery truck, who knows? These are just the adhesive stamps. So keep this number, this 90 million stamps in mind and how big it is as we go through the rest of this. The leftovers, what happened to the great stock of Seebeck Postal Stationery? To review a little bit, Seebeck, 1857, 6 years older than Charles Phillips, who he would not have met him until Phillips later moved to the United States after he sold his company. So Seebeck was a stationer, meaning he supplied business paper to companies that needed paper for business. Everything was on paper, written by hand then, all the records, not on computer. He called himself an engraver, although he never really did engraving himself. He supplied and contracted engraving, and he also did the same with lithography, and he was a manufacturer of blank books. Something probably passed down from his dad, who was a bookbinder. When the family moved from Germany, they settled near Gary, Indiana for a time, and his father worked there as a bookbinder. And very shortly thereafter, Nicholas, as a teenager, was in New York, a seller of postage stamps to collectors and stamp albums, and establishing his stationery business. To get to the stamps that he did, and stationery eventually, we know almost as a certainty that he was the contractor for the postage stamps of the Colombian state of Bolivar. But we do not have a contract. We know that he was the contractor for the postage stamps and postal stationery of the Dominican Republic, almost as a near certainty, but we do not have a contract. We have the text of the contracts that he signed in 1889 with El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and the contract that Henry Etheridge signed with Ecuador in 1890 that came into Seebeck's and under his control. How many stamps and stationery did these contracts authorize? Well, if you take the numbers that are in the contracts that we have, El Salvador, 1.5 million adhesive stamps is in that contract in 1889, 45,000 postal stationery items, and so on for Honduras. Nicaragua and Ecuador were larger, same as Honduras, 2 million adhesive stamps, and you see the numbers. It is much easier today to be a collector of Nicaragua because this many stationery items were created. Same with Ecuador, Honduras, much more difficult. El Salvador, believe it or not, much more difficult, especially if you want used ones. So if you project these quantities over the 10 years that El Salvador received material and the 10 years that Nicaragua received material and the 6 years that Honduras received material and the 4 years that Ecuador received material from Seebeck and the Hamilton Banknote Engraving and Printing Company, you get a total of 55 million adhesive stamps that by contract supposedly were supplied to these countries, and a little under 4 million postal stationery items. So we started out with 90 million leftovers, yet the contracts called for about that many if we projected over the contract year. So in other words, Seebeck, and you'll see Gus Colman, produced at least 3 times what the contracts called for, and probably more like 4 or 5 times. There's no way to really know. But they produced a lot of stuff. Why not? You got the stuff on press, keep the press turning. Why go to the extra expense of doing it a second time when you have it on press the first time? So how did these stamps and stationery items get to the market? Meet the suave and debonair Gustav Colman. Gus was the greatest stamp wholesaler of his era from 1880 to 1898. In 1883, when he is 23 years old, Gus Colman buys Seebeck's retail stamp business. This would be his shop, where in his shop he was also selling stamps and conducting his stationery business. In '85, Gus and his brother and probably some others buy J.W. Scott and Company. This name with the word "and" in it, J.W. Scott and Company, was John Walter Scott's first incorporated stamp company. I say it that way because Scott was dabbling as a younger man in England and in the United States without being a formal company. But this was a formal company. Colman buys this. By the way, in '84, Seebeck joins the Hamilton Banknote Engraving and Printing Company. He buys in, he becomes 1/6 owner. A lot of people think it was Seebeck's company. It was in the sense that he was the general manager and he made the company click. He made it profitable, but he was not the owner. He was one of the owners. '88, thereabouts, circa '88, Gus Colman buys Seebeck stock of the Colombian state of Bolivar and the Dominican Republic. He buys it as a wholesaler and he becomes the person who brings it all to market. It's not Seebeck, it's Gus Colman. In about 1890-91, Gus contracts with Seebeck to wholesale the items that Seebeck created under the 4 major contracts: Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, Ecuador. We don't know exactly when that happened. The basics of the contracts you will remember is that the Hamilton Company and Seebeck provided free stamps and free stationery for 10 years, if you went the whole 10-year contract, in exchange for the rights to all remainders and the ability to reprint any as needed, which they did. I bought this very ordinary looking card in early 2018. It is a card from Gus Colman to stamp dealer Adolph Lohmeyer in Baltimore, Maryland. It's 1893. The date's right in there, and the year date on the back. The important part is what Gus crossed out. He is repurposing a printed card dated March 27th, 1893. On or about May 1st, I shall send you a supply of the Nicaragua stamps of the 1892 issue at the same prices and under the same conditions at which I sold you the 1891 issue. Yours truly, printed G.B. Colman. So that's all crossed out. Now, to me, that's the important part, because this is absolute proof that Gus had the contract to wholesale this stuff. He probably got the contract in 1890 or 91, but this card says he at least had it by 92 or 93. I had to do a lot of deep breathing before I could read that handwriting at the bottom, but I have finally figured it out. And it shows what a wheeler dealer Gus Colman was. This says, I offer, if unsold, to arrive 100 Western Australia card, 1 penny per 100, $6. He is offering him a contract here which has phrases in it, if unsold, meaning I'm making this offer to everybody I'm sending these cards to, so you can only get it if you're the first to answer. And to arrive means I don't even have them in my hands yet. So he is selling stuff that he doesn't even have yet to anybody under the sun who might want these, including this one, Lohmeyer. So I would think that there are other cards just like this, possibly floating around out there unless they were thrown away. Luckily, this one did not get thrown away. How was Gus Colman able to buy up all this stuff? This is an invoice, 1896, of the Emil Colman and Company at 299 Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan. Those old buildings don't exist anymore. Those are medium-rise apartments now. But right up here, it lists Emil Colman, Gustav B. Colman, and Charles Colman as the principals of this business, the Emil Colman and Company Varnishes and Japans. Japans are basically black varnish. It's varnish with bitumen in it. Think of the old iron sewing machines. Those were japanned. Think of the Model T Ford. That was japanned. That was why Henry Ford said, you can have it in any color you want as long as it's black, right? Japanning dried in 2 days. Painting a car back then took about a week to cure up and dry. So that's why Henry Ford wanted all his Model Ts to be black, and almost all of them were. But this is what this company manufactured and created. The point of this invoice is that Gustav B. Colman is up here on the same level as his dad. He's a big deal in this company. Here's a picture of some kind of a trade card or a poster of the factory, which doesn't say where it is. It says New York, New York, but it's actually on Long Island. That is a locomotive coming out of there, so you can see it's a big operation. Another, probably a trade card, I called it here. This mentions the office at 299 Pearl Street. Here's a Gus Colman envelope mailed to Germany in 1895. Notice that the address 299 Pearl Street is marked out, and 42 East 23rd Street, New York is marked in there. Gus was operating his stamp business out of his dad's varnish factory for years until he moved to this office at 42 East 23rd Street, which is still there. Here's another view of it. Don't know what floor he was on, but it still stands. Many of the buildings that the old-time dealers were in are still there. How much longer will they last? No air conditioning in that building. The cover that you saw right back here, it was 1895. Gus dies in 1898 at a young age. What happened to all the stuff that he had? Well, his brother Henry L. Colman, Lincoln was his middle name, born in the USA like his brother. When they bought J.W. Scott and Company from John Walter Scott in December 1885, it took some time for them to actually buy all of the stock of the company. So it was a transition. It wasn't immediate on one day. And per a stipulation of that contract, they were required to change the name of the company from J.W. Scott and Company to Scott Stamp and Coin Company Limited, which they did do. While the Colmans owned that company, Scott's first incorporated company, the 87 Scott catalog was the first to use a numbering system, a catalog numbering system. Nobody really knows who invented the Scott numbering system, but it was probably Henry Colman or a Britisher who they hired named Henry Collin, C-O-L-L-I-N. There's a well-known catalog. The authors are Collin and Colman, both named Henry. So it's one of these guys who invented the Scott numbering system. In other words, John Walter Scott, the namesake of the Scott catalog system, never assigned a Scott catalog number to a stamp in his life. The Colmans did it. Effective in June '89, Henry became the editor of the American Journal of Philately, succeeding Scott. So Scott hung on for 4 years editing that, keeping it going, even though he had sold his company, including the journal. Basically, this is an ancestor of the Scott Stamp Monthly. Now, Gus dies in 1898. Henry gets control of everything through the estate, and he eventually starts to sell stuff off. He sold Scott Stamp and Coin Company to a stock company. It went through many changes of ownership. When someone named James Hatcher owned it, he split the company in two, to a retail company and a publishing company of albums and the catalogs. And it is that catalog company that still exists today as Amos Media, Amos Press. The retail half faded away, basically, and disappeared. One of the things that Colman did was he sold the stock of postal stationery to a dealer named J.E. Hanshaw, James Hanshaw. He's a big part of the story. Here's a Gus Colman envelope postmarked in 1903. This I show because even though Gus was dead, Henry is still operating the company and winding it down and getting rid of its assets. So that's why this corner Here, G.B. Colman is stamped on there, and it's that same address that I showed you, 42 East 23rd in Manhattan. Here's a Colman calendar from 1914. Found this on the internet. It's described as a proof, and I guess it is because of these color bars here. The tear-off pages of the calendar would have gone here. This looks like that one trade card that I showed you. The one mermaid is holding up a can of varnish. The plant burned to the ground in 2002, and months later, the founder, Emil Colman, died, but it was rebuilt, and the company lasted into the 1930s, and I think Henry was a big part of making it work. But it eventually went out of business. So here's Hanshaw. Hanshaw buys the stock of leftover stationery from Henry, who had it because his brother died, who had it because he had the deal with Seebeck. Again, we're looking at somebody who was born in 1855, 1860s. Who was Hanshaw? Hanshaw, in his younger days, was a carpenter, a roofer, and a job printer. The job printer is a very important part of the story, and he was a part-time stamp dealer. He had the misfortune of falling off a roof during carpentry work, and he was unable to perform more physical activity, so he became a full-time stamp dealer. First operating from Smithtown Branch, New York, that's on Long Island, and eventually moved to Manhattan. He is the person who bought Scott's second formal stamp company. That was J.W. Scott Company Limited. The first one was called J.W. Scott and Company. This one is just Company Limited. He buys the second company when Scott is an older man, and he has it for 4 years. In 1921, he sells his stock of postal cards and envelopes to a collector named Siegfried Shackney in Chillicothe, Ohio. That's south central Ohio. And in his memoirs, Hanshaw wrote, they were packed in boxes, some 20 of them. We don't know how big the box is, but if you take that same 10-ream paper carton, I estimate you can get maybe 5,000 to 6,000 stationery items in there, be they cards or envelopes, folded up wrappers, if they are crammed tightly together. Just a very ballpark estimate. So 20 cartons, if they were that size, is not that many. 20 times 6,000 is only 120,000. But it had to be a lot more than that. Primarily because Hanshaw was doing this with them. This is an 1897 Nicaragua, the 97 dates right in there, Nicaragua 10-centavo envelope that Hanshaw is using as blank stationery stock, putting a U.S. stamp on it. This is mailed in 1910. There's the year, and here is his corner card with his Smithtown Branch, New York address. And it says there, the largest stock of entire foreign stamped envelopes, newspaper wrappers, and postal cards in the world. Just a thing for advertising purposes or collections. Send for a list. And this is sent to another stamp company. So he's using it up as blank stationery. This is a picture from his memoirs, his autobiography, of him standing with the printing outfit that he bought as a younger man. Many people did this back then and had small printing operations. Here's a 1895 Nicaragua card, which Hanshaw printed on the back with his Smithtown Branch, New York address, encouraging people to advertise, specifically by buying printing services from him. Here's a Salvador card, 1893, with Hanshaw's J.W. Scott Company. This is the company that Hanshaw bought from Scott, got his name on it, 36 John Street in New York. This is Lower Manhattan. Again, this building doesn't exist. It's an entrance to the subway now. This address here dates this card printing to about 1916 or 17. Here's Scott as a younger man in his 40s, and in 1917, about the time he sold out to Hanshaw. 1891 card, Honduras. The Holton Stamp Company in Boston, Mass. there is offering Honduras envelopes and wrappers, and the years are 90, 91, 92, and that's it. So I guess we can't date that, when it was printed. Here's a Dominican Republic double card, used as blank stationery, again with a penny stamp added for the US postage, sent to Philadelphia, and it's got a long ad for mixture. Here's the other side of it, H.S. Powell, Storm Lake, Iowa. You see a lot of these, enough that you find these in dealer stocks, they want $5, $10 for them, basically. Here's Hanshaw's stamp office, about 1915. That is Hanshaw right there. That's his son, William. And this person I do not know. Again, no air conditioning. This is William Hanshaw, who did not have to go overseas. He was drafted late into World War I, went back to stamp dealing. Here is a corner from William Hanshaw, again using up another 1897 10 centavo envelope. Not a reprint, it's an original with a 1-cent stamp. Mailed to Pennsylvania in the years right there, 1920, after the war. Here's the William Hanshaw, another one, 93, Nicaragua. 102 Fulton Street is crossed out, printed, and his Nassau Street address is added onto that one. Here's a 91 double card. It's another Storm Lake, Iowa, H.S. Powell, selling mixtures. 25 pounds, 50 pounds, 100 pounds. Those were some mixtures back in those days. Here's an 1895 Nicaragua card with almost the entire front obliterated. Some of it double obliterated here with the heavy X's. Addressed to someone in France. No postmarks. The back of it is dated to the 1940s. There's a pre-printed 194 date there with a space to write in the year. It's a circuit exchange card for postmark collectors. So, in 91, Hanshaw sells his entire holding to Shackney, who was a big-time postal stationery collector. Notice again, 1860. So it's still within the same generation of people. This is a passport, that's Shackney right there, Mrs. Shackney. You can still go to Chillicothe, Ohio, and buy furniture or a mattress from the Globe Furniture Company that he founded. The company is still in business. In 1924, he sells his entire stationery collection to Walton Mitchell in California. Mitchell wrote, Shackney kept the Seebeck accumulation in unopened crates in his basement where the flaps became stuck down. So this is why almost all Seebeck envelopes that you see in dealer stocks today and in collections, not all of them, but almost all of them have the black back flaps stuck down because primarily Shackney kept them in his basement. Here's Mitchell, the one who bought them from Shackney. Owners after Mitchell, according to Mitchell, somebody named Walter Gray here, I've never heard of him, who eventually sold it to Harry Gray. I don't know if they are related. Who sold them to a man in the East, who knows who that is, who sold them to Prescott Thorpe, nicknamed Pep. The next paragraph does not really relate to the Seebecks, but the Mitchell hoard of stuff went to Alexander Gage of Higgins and Gage, who sold it to Mel and Pat Feiner, who owned it as Classic Philatelics for many years. Many of you will remember Mel and Pat Feiner. Maybe even you remember Pep Thorpe. I do not. And eventually that stationery business in the catalog went to Christoph Gärtner of Germany, who is still in business primarily as an auction firm. Here's Pep Thorpe. He published this catalog in 1954, known as the Century Edition of United States Envelopes, published after 100 years of US envelopes, basically. Here's a card from Pep. If you see any card, any Seebeck card with a stamp on it like this, canceled in Netcong, New Jersey, the back is almost certainly going to look like this, where Pep is using up the old stationery to push his catalog. He's advertising his catalog and using up the stock as old stationery. Whoa! This thing turned up on eBay in 2018. And I immediately saw this was the 1891 issue of the 2-centavo card, and I couldn't believe it. Knocked myself out of my chair, and I said I had to buy these, and I did. There was one bidder competing against me, so I guesstimated there were maybe 450, 500 cards there, and I had to have it. Here's another view of them. It turned out there were 660 cards there. So I've got the world supply right now. This is pink stock with a dark green underprint of the map and some of the other stuff. And then the dark green is the border and the major legends and the imprinted stamp. The original card has, right here, the first pearl is covered up by my red circle, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And basically, 2 of these pearls stick out. That's the original card. Every card you see used will look like that. Guarantee it. In this mass of 660 cards, it was about evenly divided in 3 ways. 1/3 originals, 1/3 this, which I call the new design card. This card has 1, 2, 3, 4. Only 1 pearl sticks out. Over on the other side of the top of the card, there is differences in the engraving, and there are differences in the engraving and the border. The elements of that are different. In other words, this was not a reprint. This is just a brand new card from a brand new plate. The other third of the 660 that I bought were single cards with the legend Respuesta Pagada on top. Reply paid. All singles. I have never seen one of these cards as a double. I went through each group of third, and I could plate them. I had previously plated some of the cards. By plating, I mean I can put them all in piles and say, these are all exactly alike by the flaws or intricacies or hoo-hoos or whatever. Some of them are quite small. Some of them you can see with the naked eye. But I plated the original card, plates to 11 positions. The new design card plates to 16 positions, and this half card plates to 14 positions. There are probably 16, maybe there are 20, but the stone that printed these was probably laid out 4 by 4 or 5 by 4. These stones could be this big, and they were like this 3-4 inches thick, these lithographic stones, and they were reused. They were heavy. You had to have special equipment to move it, or you needed 4, maybe 6 men to pick one up and move it. They were big. These are line engraved designs, recess engraved, that were transferred to the lithographic stone, and they feel flat as a pancake, but they are engravings. They're top-notch work. Second to none, these engravings by Hamilton, be they adhesive stamps or stationery. I found this new design with the single pearl back in '89 or so, and I didn't know what it was. I called it a new design or a reprint or something, and over time, when eBay came along, I looked at every one, and you could tell. The images were good enough online that you could tell, and I was buying them up, and I thought, wow, I'm really locking into something that nobody else knows about. And I was. Then I bought 600, so now I have the world supply, and they're very common, except I have them all. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Michael for his highly informative presentation on Nicholas Seebeck and providing us with another dimension of his famed postal background.
On behalf of the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library, I'd like to thank you for having taken the time to visit with us on this video. You'll find that this is one of a number of videos that we've produced over the years in the effort to provide educational services to the stamp collecting public. The Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library is located in Denver, Colorado, at 2038 South Pontiac Way. Our hours are 10 to 4, 5 days a week, with 1 day of extended hours. The library offers collectors of every kind and to the general public a host of materials that are related to stamp collecting and world history. There are over 60,000 journals contained in 800 specific journals. We have a map room, we have special collections devoted to individual countries, and we have special libraries that are devoted to individual countries. For further information about the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library, we invite you to visit the library or visit us online at our website,